As mandated by federal copyright law, any form of unauthorized recording or photography is strictly prohibited. There will be no intermission. Thank you, and enjoy the presentation.
Hello everyone, and welcome. My name is Thomas O'Keefe, and I'm a master's student in orchestral conducting here at James Madison University. I'm so happy to be here with you all to dive into a piece of music that's not only one of my personal favorites, but is one that I think exemplifies the power of music to capture the human spirit. The relationship between nature and artists is a storied one, with human beings of all backgrounds and cultures and in all artistic mediums dedicating some of their time and curiosity to it. In the field of music, perhaps one of the most prominent of these examples can be found in Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral. The Pastoral Symphony was finished in 1808 and is labeled as the Sixth Symphony, Opus 68, just one opus after Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, Opus 67. However, there's evidence from Beethoven's sketchbooks that he began writing material for the Sixth Symphony as early as 1803, before he had even finished his Third Symphony. It is one of only two titled symphonies in Beethoven's catalog, the other being the third, the Eroica. And it's worth noting that sometimes the Fifth Symphony is called the Fate Symphony, but this title wasn't given by Beethoven himself, and so it doesn't hold the same weight as the other two. The Sixth is also his only symphony in 5 movements, and it is one of the only pieces in his entire output to feature descriptive titles on those individual movements. The titles of the movements approximately translate from the original German as follows. The first movement begins with an awakening of happy feelings on arriving in the country. This is followed by the second movement, Seen by the Brook. The third movement describes the merrymaking of country folk. This is followed by a fourth movement titled Thunder, Storm. And finally, the fifth movement is titled Shepherd's Song, Happy and Thankful Feelings After the Storm. This titling and the evocation of nature sounds in the music, such as running water in the beginning of the second movement, and some specifically labeled bird calls by the composer, the Pastoral Symphony is often viewed through the lens of early program music, where depiction of stories, characters, and even the sound painting of specific landscapes would become an important musical tool to composers of the Romantic period. The Pastoral Symphony was written tangentially to Beethoven's Fifth, and was premiered on the same concert program in December 1808. They also share the same dedication to Joseph Franz Maximilian and Count Andrei Razumovsky, two longtime patrons of Beethoven. These background similarities often spawn comparisons between the two works, but they're most often placed side by side for their differences rather than their similarities. These comparisons usually point out the huge contrast in emotive tone, harmonic language, and structure between the two works. The fifth is dark and dramatic, while the sixth is more peaceful. The fifth features greater harmonic variety in comparison to the sixth's overtly major tonality. and the fifth features a four-movement, untitled structure, while the fifth features its five titled movements. If these two symphonies are twins, they're fraternal twins, with the Fifth Symphony exemplifying Beethoven's concision and mastery of the symphonic model, while the Sixth Symphony begins to point towards the way that tone poems would depict nature later on in the 19th century. However, Beethoven also said that he intended the Pastoral Symphony to be, quote, more the expression of feeling than painting. And this is reflected in the titling of those movements. The first movement references feelings. The second movement describes a scene by the brook rather than a scene of the brook. The third movement references people, the merrymaking of country folk, but not nature. And the Fifth Symphony calls to mind a shepherd and feelings of thankfulness, a very human thing. It's only the fourth movement, Thunderstorm, which is expressly labeled for a natural phenomenon. Indeed, this is not something that's exclusive to Beethoven's Sixth Symphony either. Indeed, Carl Czerny, a student of Beethoven's, later said that Beethoven had been inspired by the bird call of a yellowhammer for the main motive in his Fifth Symphony. Here is an example from a recent blog post by Dean McConnell, an ecologist who runs a bioacoustic blog called Habitat Sounds. It's not hard to hear the connection between these sounds, and this is a theme that's pervasive throughout the entirety of the Fifth Symphony. Yet no one would make the claim that the Fifth is about birds just because it uses their sounds as inspiration. Furthermore, depiction of nature in music is not something that was invented by Beethoven. Famously, Vivaldi depicted natural phenomena in his work The Four Seasons many years before. Therefore, there must be something else that makes Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony such a powerful work and representative of nature music. I'd like to suggest a slightly different take on the relationship between the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies of Beethoven. One where they both share the same underlying philosophy of hope and the indomitability of the human spirit, simply reaching it by different roads. Beethoven is often credited as the most important and influential figure in the transition between the classical and romantic periods in music. I think this is an accurate assessment, but I also believe that human beings, being imperfect and social creatures, seldom arrive at new ways of thinking without the influence of the people around them. This is not to discredit Beethoven's mighty contributions to the field of music, but rather to contextualize his achievements within the larger societal structures which drove him towards these conclusions. I think one of the most important of these was the fact that he lived at the tail end of the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment was in part the aftermath of the scientific revolution, when people began to rely more on the power of human reasoning, whether that be through scientific method or observation, and they relied less and less on preconceived notions and knowledge passed down to them by authority figures. At that time, whether that be government institutions or religious leaders. The ways that people responded to this shift is incredibly diverse and happened over the course of hundreds of years, but philosophies of some prominent thinkers in this time still have massive repercussions on the way that we live today. Philosophers such as John Locke, Adam Smith, and Montesquieu became foundational to the emergence of many of the world's major democracies, and to the idea that there should be inherent rights for individuals in a free society. This includes the foundation of the United States of America, whose framers drew deeply from Enlightenment philosophy and were working around the same time that Beethoven was composing, or a little earlier. So, how does this relate to Ludwig van Beethoven, a German composer of concert music? We know from Beethoven's writings that he was familiar with the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant's focus was not on economics or political systems, but rather on human ethics and metaphysics. In other words, he wrote about the way human beings understand the world around us and how we fit into it. In the context of Enlightenment philosophy, he was primarily interested in reconciling rationalism with human morality. Where art is concerned, one of Kant's most important ideas was the concept of transcendental idealism. In essence, he argues that as far as human understanding is concerned, the natural world around us only only exists as we perceive it, and so human beings can only ever know something for how it appears to them, and that this perception is anything but objective. In this sense, we tend to project elements of human meaning onto objects that may not intrinsically have that meaning. For example, the chairs you're sitting in now are a place to sit because human beings have designed them to be so. But if you were walking through the woods, you might just as readily enlist a large rock or a fallen log or an old tree stump for the same purpose, imbuing it with a sense of meaning largely driven by human need and not by its intrinsic meaning. This applies to art in the sense that an artist can never truly capture something that is without it being reflective of their perspective on that thing. This seems obvious when put that way, but it's an important distinction that puts human perspective in the forefront of any art that seems to be depicting the natural world. Through this lens, it's impossible to observe Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony as a depiction of nature without considering that it is also a reflection of the way that Beethoven experienced nature, how he felt about nature, and most importantly, how he saw humanity reflected in nature. This idea, in conjunction with Beethoven's quote about feeling rather than painting, leads to the idea that the pastoral is about human nature rather than just nature itself. This idea also further complicates our role as a performer. If our job is to the best of our ability, reflect and honor the composer's intentions, we're still only ever going to be able to do so through our own perspective. By playing Beethoven's Sixth, we are engaging in a process of delivering our perspective on Beethoven's perspective on nature, which makes things like an objective authenticity feel like a fraught pursuit. Another important consideration is Immanuel Kant's writing on teleology. Teleology is an approach to explaining the natural world through the lens of a thing's purpose or goal, and it dates back at least as far as ancient Greece and the philosopher Aristotle. In some ways, it's a sort of reverse engineering and a reverse way of thinking, using reason to explain things by looking at where they're headed rather than where they came from. This became influential in fields such as biology as a means of explaining, among other things, the process of evolution in animals as progressing towards something. In that case, the end goal being adaptation for better survivability. This thought process is deeply connected to another philosopher that Beethoven was familiar with, Christoph Christian Sturm. Sturm was an early thinker in a movement that would become known as nature philosophy. This movement comes down to the idea that the entirety of the natural world is one strictly intertwined process, working towards a sense of order and perfect hierarchy. In essence, both Sturm and Kant thought that the processes of nature are not a reaction to past events, but rather a development towards some ultimate purpose. In the case of humanity, this ultimate goal would be something like the resolution of conflict and a release from suffering, something that Kant called perpetual peace. Though lofty in scope, these ideas were not lost on Beethoven. He owned an influential book from Sturm, which is titled in English, Reflections on the Works of God in the Realm of Nature. And in reference to Immanuel Kant, Beethoven copied out an excerpt from his Critique of Practical Reason, a quote which is now on the philosopher's tombstone. The moral law within us and the starry skies above us. So, armed with a new rudimentary knowledge of the Enlightenment philosophy that Beethoven was familiar with, the question becomes, how does this impact Beethoven's musical expression? There are a few different ways that the influence of this kind of thinking can be seen in the Sixth Symphony. In several movements of the work, Beethoven's aesthetic choices reveal a bit of his perspective. Its long pedal tones, slow harmonic rhythm, and overwhelming dominance of major tonalities speak to a more peaceful side of Beethoven. He wrote in a letter once, "How happy I am to be able to walk among the shrubs, the trees, the woods, the grass, and the rocks. For the woods, the trees, and the rocks give man the resonance he needs." I find the use of the word resonance here a little auspicious. Although Beethoven was probably referring to a more personal resonance rather than a musical one, it's clear that the personal joy he found in his frequently documented nature walks translated to his musical vernacular in this symphony, especially in comparison to the symphony that precedes it. It's worth noting that this perspective on nature as a sanctuary of human peace also places this symphony in a different space and time than ours. While I won't deny that many people, including myself, find peace in nature today, I think many modern artists are also interested in reflecting a more antagonistic view of the relationship between humanity and nature. There is an enormous amount of art today about the destruction of the natural world, whether that be through deforestation, climate change, mass extinction, and all sorts of man-made environmental disasters. For example, in the classical music sphere, John Luther Adams' 2014 work, Become Ocean, depicts human civilization lost to flood as a result of melting polar ice caps. Man versus nature is a long-established form of conflict in art, but the version with human beings as the aggressor rather than the victim of nature is a more recent phenomenon, and one which Beethoven would not have been as concerned with. This impacts not only Beethoven's process as a composer, but also the way that a conductor might approach performing this music. In a moment, we're going to play the first section of his second movement, Seen by the Brook. In terms of composition, I want you to listen specifically to how slowly the harmony changes and how it creates a sense of ease and a lack of tension. In terms of performance, we'll keep the accompaniment steady, predictable, and fluid as a reflection of the teleological approach, while phrasing the melodic lines above it as more free, more playful, and more human. This is the first section of the second movement, Seen by the Brook. So you can hear in that excerpt that it's very smooth, it's very flowing. It's depicting water, but it's also very destination driven. Beyond aesthetics, this sort of Kantian view of nature has an impact on the means of musical development in Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. Take, for example, the development of the first movement. At the most basic level, a development section in a sonata form movement uses the musical material of the exposition to modulate to distant keys before returning to the home key at the opening of the recapitulation. This movement does that, but it does it in the framework of the aesthetics that he's already set in motion. In many developments, the harmonic rhythm speeds up to get to distant keys. But in this development, Beethoven does the opposite, using a very slow harmonic motion and using just a couple of musical fragments from the opening measures of the piece. We're going to play the opening so you can hear the building blocks that Beethoven is working with. This is the very beginning of the piece. The material that you just heard makes up about 90% of the material that will be used in the development, which is another thing that this symphony has in common with the Fifth Symphony, this use of small cells in development. Here's a form diagram of the development section. On the left, we have the two musical fragments that you just heard from the beginning of the piece. After a brief transition, fragment A is repeated in a long harmonic progression, which lasts 48 measures, represented by that top line. As you can see from the second line, this 48 measure section is then repeated in its entirety in a long musical sequence, with very, very small changes. This leads to 32 measures of development on fragment B, which is once again sequentially repeated through the circle of fifths. This long-form repetition is very teleological in nature, creating a sense that the recap is inevitable from the very beginning, in a way turning the entire development into one long retransition. This idea of teleology also has some important implications on the way that this development should be performed. If a listener is to hear this sort of harmonic teleology, it makes sense to create very long phrases which emphasize the destination of these progressions, zooming out and looking at the big picture rather than focusing in on the smaller details. In other words, not missing the forest for the trees. We're going to play the development in its entirety now, so you can hear this long sense of arrival. We'll begin playing at the top left of that diagram and end partway into the transition. In different contexts, this long-term repetition could be seen as pedantic, but I think the payoff of its conclusion makes perfect sense in the world Beethoven is creating. The inevitability of the harmonic changes of this development is reflective of the processes laid out in nature philosophy, with all of these small building blocks of the symphony working together in harmony towards the same goal. Now, the unique aesthetic and developmental techniques of the Sixth Symphony are undoubtedly a reflection of its connection to nature. But in its overarching conception, it shares more in common with the Fifth Symphony than most give it credit for. The philosophies of Kant and the inevitability of the inner moral law he describes can be seen very clearly in the structure of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. The Fifth Symphony is structured in the traditional four movements. It begins with an Allegro con brio in C minor, which is followed by an Andante con moto in A flat. It continues with a scherzo Allegro in C minor, and ends with an Allegro presto in C major. At the time, ending a minor key piece with a full movement in a major key had very little precedence, and it would have certainly been a surprise to Beethoven's audience. But when examined through a teleological approach, the purpose of this symphony is evident. The whole piece functions to progress out of the stormy and turbulent C minor to the triumph of C major. Every movement sets this arc up, with little hints at C major along the way in each movement. The most important structural asset of the symphony is the fact that the third movement connects seamlessly to the fourth in a long transitional section. Though it's overshadowed by the more programmatic associations, a remarkably similar arc can be found in the structure of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. The Pastoral, again, is the only symphony that Beethoven wrote in 5 movements, but this departure from the regular symphonic model makes perfect sense if viewed through the same lens as the Fifth. This arc is reflected, for example, in the programmatic titles and associations of each movement. The first 2 movements set the scene, which, as we determined, is a peaceful one. Then it gets interesting. The final 3 movements are connected with a simple narrative in the titles. The scherzo is the merrymaking of country folk and features a set of folksy country dances, especially the rustic dance, which forms the trio. This merry gathering is soured by the emergence of the 4th movement, a thunderstorm, which depicts crashing thunder and lightning. This storm then gives way to the peace of the final movement, a shepherd's song, happy and thankful feelings after the storm. This story arc is further accentuated by the fact that, like the Fifth, the last movements of this piece are played continuously, with no gaps in between them. This arc of sort of joy to uncertainty to thankfulness is both narratively and musically similar to the associations of the Fifth Symphony, and reflects the same teleological progression of nature philosophy, being destination-driven rather than reactive. Indeed, this similarity can be seen most clearly by reconsidering the attacca movements of both symphonies as one musical unit. In the Fifth Symphony, the scherzo and finale become one larger movement. In the Pastoral, the same thing happens, except the final 3 movements become one larger movement. The end product is 2 symphonies with the same structure. A first movement which sets up the overarching character and tone of the piece, a slow movement in a related key, and a final hyper movement which features both the darkest point of the symphony and its resolution. In response to reception of the Fifth Symphony, Beethoven wrote, "Many assert that every minor piece must end in the minor. On the contrary, I find that the major has a glorious effect. Joy follows sorrow, sunshine, rain." In Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, it's evident that the progression is one from sorrow to joy. And in the Sixth, the programmatic titles explicitly describe sunshine following rain. This process of redemption through form is one that Beethoven would continue to use in his career. This process underlines the element that I believe makes Beethoven's music so uniquely powerful. The use of form not only as a structure for individual movements of a piece, but as a means of turning a multi-movement work into a narrative progression and a wordless story. All the more potent that the story he chose to tell is perhaps the most human story of all. Hope in the face of struggle, triumph through pain, the promise of sunshine. We're going to end by playing the last three movements of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony straight through, but first I'd like to do some Thanksgiving of my own. To all the teachers in my life, musical and otherwise, past and present, I want to thank you for broadening my perspectives and assuring me that it's a good thing that there's always more to learn. To my friends, both near and far, thank you for keeping me centered and pulling me back down to earth when I need it. To you, the audience, both the physical one here and the one online, whether that's now or sometime in the future, I hope that your perception of this lecture is a positive one. To this amazing, amazing orchestra behind me, thank you so much. Conductors can't do anything without musicians in front of us. So I really appreciate that you gave your time to this. To Sean Tucker, Chloe Waters, Tom Carr, Chloe Savage, Nick Adams, Puck Wade, and all the staff of the Forbes Center, as well as Brian Gentilla in the music office, thank you for helping make the logistics of this happen. You work magic. To my committee members, Dr. Stephen Bolstad and Dr. Wanchi Huang, thank you for giving your time to this. I really appreciate you being here. To my first conducting teacher, Stacy Griffin, thank you for giving me the shove I needed to believe that I belonged in music. To my previous conducting teacher, Dr. Kevin Suderlin, thank you for your generosity. The time and opportunities you invested in me have changed my life. And to my current conducting teacher, Professor Foster Byers, thank you for giving me a chance to be your student. Your love of music has inspired me, and your approach to musicianship has fundamentally changed my perspective on how to listen and how to lead. And finally, to my family, my siblings for being the biggest constant in my life, and my mom and dad for teaching me with your words to always work hard, and with your actions to do it with other people.